In a small community center in Millbrook, a 70-year-old woman was about to confront her past. What started as evening tutoring took a shocking turn when she came face to face with her own childhood reflected in another's struggle. Lily Cox wasn't your typical grandmother. For 60 years, she had carried impossible burdens, known for sacrificing everything for others. When she encountered 16-year-old Maria Santos working multiple jobs to support her sick grandmother, she had no idea she was walking into a reckoning with generational trauma. Lily's recognition would lead to questioning everything about sacrifice and love. What began as mentoring would become breaking destructive cycles. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Lily Cox's hands trembled slightly as she set the manila folder on the coffee table, Dr. Morrison's words still echoing in the quiet of her living room. "Progressive heart failure," he'd said, his voice carrying the practiced gentleness of someone who'd delivered such news too many times. "We can manage it, but..." The "but" hung in the air like factory smoke, acrid and inescapable. She'd driven home in silence, her old Honda navigating the familiar streets of Millbrook with the certainty of muscle memory. The town had changed since her childhood. The textile factory now stood empty, its broken windows like hollow eyes watching over the community that had once depended on its rhythm. Progress, they called it. Lily wondered if the children who no longer worked 12-hour shifts would agree. Now, surrounded by the accumulated artifacts of 7 decades, she felt the weight of every choice pressing against her chest. Photo albums lay spread across the worn sofa cushions, their pages yellow with age. Wedding pictures of her and David, their faces young and hopeful. Images of Sarah's graduation from social work school, her daughter's proud smile so reminiscent of her father's. Jake's high school baseball team, her grandson standing tall in the back row, unaware of the struggles that had paved his way to that carefree moment. Her fingers found the small cardboard rectangle almost by accident, tucked between the pages of an old album like a pressed flower. The factory ID badge was faded, the photograph barely recognizable. A 10-year-old girl with serious eyes and carefully braided hair, trying to look older than her years. Lily Cox, employee number 347, read the worn text beneath. The room seemed to shift around her, present dissolving into past like sugar in rain. The factory floor stretched before her like a cathedral of industry, its ceiling lost in shadows and steam. The air tasted of cotton fibers and machine oil, thick enough to catch in her throat. Other workers moved through the maze of looms with practiced efficiency, their conversations lost beneath the thunder of machinery. "You'll start here," Frank Morrison said, his voice gruff but not unkind. The foreman's weathered hands showed her how to feed the thread, how to watch for breaks, how to keep her fingers clear of the hungry mechanisms. "Pay attention. These machines don't forgive mistakes." She nodded solemnly, her small hands already learning the rhythm. At home, her father's cough had grown worse overnight, and her mother's medicine bottles stood like sentinels on the kitchen counter, each one representing another bill they couldn't afford. This job, this lie about her age, was their only hope. The shrill ring of the telephone pulled Lily back to the present. She blinked, disoriented, her hand instinctively moving to her chest, where her heart fluttered like a caged bird. "Mom?" Sarah's voice carried that particular note of worry that had become increasingly familiar. "I just wanted to check on you after your appointment. How did it go?" Lily glanced at the medical folder, its contents feeling like a verdict she wasn't ready to share. "Fine, sweetheart. Just routine maintenance on an old machine." "Mom?" Sarah's tone sharpened with the authority of someone trained to recognize evasion. What did Dr. Morrison say? The years compressed between them. Sarah as a toddler clinging to Lily's work dress, as a teenager frustrated by her mother's endless volunteering, as a young woman choosing social work because she'd grown up watching someone fight for others. Always watching. Always learning patterns Lily hadn't meant to teach. "My heart's a bit tired," Lily said finally. "Nothing we can't handle." The silence stretched long enough for Lily to hear the weight of everything unsaid. Sarah knew about handling things. She'd learned it from watching her mother juggle community service with child rearing, advocacy work with marriage, everyone else's needs with her own forgotten dreams. "I'm coming over," Sarah said. "You have your own family to worry about. Jake's game tonight. Jake can ride with Tom's parents. This is more important." After Sarah hung up, Lily sat in the growing dusk of her living room, surrounded by the evidence of a life spent in service to others. The community center would be expecting her soon for the evening literacy program. Children like Maria Santos would be there, struggling with homework while carrying burdens too heavy for their young shoulders. She'd first noticed Maria 3 weeks ago, a 16-year-old girl with tired eyes and carefully mended clothes, working on algebra problems between anxious glances at her phone. Something in the girl's posture had triggered recognition, a cellular memory of her own desperate determination at that age. "My grandmother is sick," Maria had explained when Lily offered help with the mathematics. "I work at the diner after school, and weekends at the grocery store. Sometimes I'm too tired to concentrate." The words had hit Lily like an echo across time. Different decade, different crisis, same impossible choice between education and survival. Now, as evening shadows lengthened across her living room, Lily understood why Dr. Morrison's news felt less like a shock and more like an appointment she'd been anticipating. Her body was finally demanding payment for decades of carrying everyone else's weight. She closed the photo albums carefully, but kept the factory ID badge in her palm. The girl in the photograph stared back at her with eyes that had seen too much too early, a child who'd believed that sacrifice always led to salvation. 70 years later, Lily wasn't certain that child had been right. The drive to the community center took her past the old textile factory, its empty parking lot now cracked with weeds. She'd helped organize the protests when it closed, fighting for worker retraining programs and severance packages. Another battle in a lifetime of battles, most of them won through sheer persistence rather than dramatic victory. Inside the community center's fluorescent bright multi-purpose room, children bent over homework assignments, while their parents attended English classes next door. The familiar scene usually brought Lily comfort. Education as resistance, knowledge as power. Tonight, it felt different. Heavier. Maria sat in her usual corner, a textbook spread before her, and her phone face down nearby. The girl's concentration was absolute, her pencil moving across the page with careful precision. She wore the same mended sweater she'd had on last week, and Lily noticed the way she rubbed her temples when she thought no one was looking. "How's your grandmother?" Lily asked, settling into the chair beside her. Maria's smile was quick and automatic, the kind children learned when adults worried too much. "Better today. The medicine helps when we can afford it." There it was. The careful admission wrapped in optimism, the way children learn to ask for help without seeming to ask. Lily recognized the technique because she'd perfected it herself 60 years ago, standing in Frank Morrison's office with school books clutched to her chest and desperation hidden behind careful politeness. "What kind of medicine?" Lily kept her voice gentle, professional. Years of advocacy work had taught her that information gathered softly carried more weight than demands made loudly. "For her heart," Maria said, then caught herself sharing too much. "She'll be fine, she just needs rest." Heart medicine. Lily's fingers unconsciously pressed against her chest, feeling the irregular flutter that Dr. Morrison said would only grow worse. 2 generations apart, 2 women facing the same choice between survival and surrender, with children caught between them. As Maria returned to her homework, Lily watched the careful way she wrote, making each letter perfect, as if precision could somehow transform their circumstances. The girl's determination was fierce and familiar, carrying the same weight Lily remembered from her own youth, the crushing responsibility of being someone's only hope. The community center's clock ticked toward closing time, but neither Maria nor Lily moved toward leaving. Instead, they sat in comfortable silence, each lost in calculations that had nothing to do with algebra. Outside, Millbrook settled into evening, its streets lined with houses where families struggled with their own impossible equations of love and necessity. Lily understood now why her heart was failing. It had been carrying too much for too long. Her own dreams deferred, her parents' hopes fulfilled through sacrifice, her children's futures secured at the cost of her present. And now, watching Maria bent over her textbook with the fierce concentration of someone fighting for more than just passing grades, Lily wondered if she was about to watch the cycle begin again. The factory ID badge felt warm in her pocket, a small piece of cardboard that had somehow become a talisman of choices made and prices paid. Tomorrow, she would need to tell Sarah about Dr. Morrison's diagnosis. Tomorrow, she would need to figure out how much help she could offer Maria without enabling the same patterns that had defined her own life. But tonight, in this fluorescent bright room where children wrestled with homework and dreams, Lily Cox sat with the weight of memory and the uncertainty of time running out, wondering if a lifetime of sacrifice had created anything more lasting than the exhaustion now pooling in her chest. The girl beside her solved another equation with careful precision, unaware that she was being watched by someone who understood exactly what it meant to carry the world at 16, and who was only now learning to question whether such carrying was strength or simply a different kind of breaking. Lily's hand tightened on the factory ID badge as she watched Maria pack her textbooks with the efficient movements of someone who'd learned to waste no motion. The community center was emptying around them, chairs scraping against linoleum as other students gathered their belongings. But neither woman moved toward the door. "Maria," Lily said softly, her voice carrying the weight of recognition. "How many hours are you working?" The girl's shoulders tensed almost imperceptibly. "It's not too much. I can handle it." Those words hit Lily like an echo from 60 years past. "I can handle it." She'd said the same thing to Frank Morrison when he'd questioned whether a 10-year-old could manage 12-hour shifts. She'd said it to her parents when they'd protested her decision to leave school. She'd said it to everyone who'd tried to suggest that a child shouldn't carry adult burdens. "The diner closes at 11, Maria continued, her voice carefully neutral. "And the grocery store only needs me mornings on weekends. I still have time for school." Lily studied the girl's face, the dark circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't quite hide, the way her hands trembled slightly from exhaustion. She saw herself at 16, standing in Sister Catherine's literacy class, fighting to keep her eyes open after another 18-hour day at the factory. "You're killing yourself, child," Sister Catherine had said, her nun's habit rustling as she moved between the desks. The evening classes were held in the church basement, lit by bare bulbs that cast harsh shadows across the faces of working children who'd come to learn what daytime jobs had stolen from them. "My parents need the medicine," young Lily had replied, the same automatic response she'd given to every expression of concern. "I can sleep when they're better." Sister Catherine's eyes had held a sadness that Lily wouldn't understand until decades later, the grief of watching children sacrifice their futures for presents that might never improve. The memory dissolved as Maria's phone buzzed against the table. The girl's face immediately shifted to worry as she read the message, her careful composure cracking. "I have to go," Maria said, already standing. "My grandmother, she's having trouble breathing." Lily rose with her, her own heart fluttering in sympathy. "Do you need a ride?" "I can." "No, thank you. The bus runs until midnight." Maria's politeness was automatic, ingrained. Never accept help that might come with obligations. Never let anyone see how desperate you really are. As the girl hurried toward the exit, Lily called after her. "Maria, tomorrow's Saturday. You don't have to work at the grocery store, do you?" Maria paused, her hand on the door handle. Yes, I do." "They need me early for inventory." The lie was gentle, but obvious. Lily recognized it because she'd told the same kinds of lies, small deceptions designed to prevent well-meaning adults from trying to fix unfixable situations. After Maria disappeared into the night, Lily sat alone in the empty community center, surrounded by the ghosts of her own past. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, their harsh brightness reminiscent of the factory floor, where she'd spent her adolescence feeding thread into hungry machines. The textile mill had been her universe for 8 years. She'd watched other children come and go, some moving on to better opportunities, others breaking under the pressure. But she'd stayed, anchored by necessity and the belief that her sacrifice would eventually save her parents. Rosa Martinez had been different. 3 years older than Lily, Rosa had arrived at the factory with fire in her eyes and rebellion in her voice. Where Lily had learned to make herself invisible, Rosa had made herself heard. "This ain't livin'," Rosa had said during one of their brief breaks, her hands working to massage feeling back into fingers cramped from hours of repetitive motion. "There's got to be more than this." "There will be," Lily had replied, her faith in eventual rewards still intact. "When my parents are well, when we catch up on the bills." Rosa's laugh had been bitter. When? What about now, Lily? What about you?" The question had haunted her then, and it haunted her now as she sat in the empty community center. What about now? What about the girl rushing home to a sick grandmother, working herself toward the same exhaustion that had defined Lily's youth? The drive to Sister Catherine's assisted living facility took 20 minutes through Millbrook's quiet streets. The Sunset Manor was a modest building, clean but institutional, where residents lived out their final years with dignity if not luxury. Lily found Sister Catherine in the common room, her slight frame dwarfed by an overstuffed chair but her eyes still sharp with intelligence. "You look troubled, child," Sister Catherine said, using the endearment she'd called Lily for 60 years. At 85, the former nun moved slowly, but her mind remained quick as ever. Lily settled into the chair beside her old mentor, grateful for the familiar comfort of Sister Catherine's presence. "I met a girl, 16 years old, working 2 jobs to support her sick grandmother." Sister Catherine's expression shifted to the same sadness Lily remembered from their literacy classes. "And you see yourself. How do I help her without enabling the same patterns?" Lily's voice cracked slightly. "What if encouraging her education means her grandmother suffers? What if helping financially means she never learns to set boundaries?" Sister Catherine was quiet for a long moment, her weathered hands folded in her lap. Around them, other residents watched television or dozed in their chairs, their own struggles reduced to managing medication schedules and visiting hours. "Do you remember Mrs. Patterson?" Sister Catherine asked finally. Lily nodded. Mrs. Patterson had been a fellow factory worker, a widow with 3 children, who'd worked herself into an early grave, trying to provide for them. "Her eldest daughter, Betty, came to our classes," Sister Catherine continued. "Bright girl, determined to break the cycle. I helped her get a scholarship to the state university." "I remember. She became a teacher." "Yes, but do you remember what happened to her youngest brother?" Lily's heart sank as the memory surfaced. "He dropped out to work when Mrs. Patterson got sick." "The cycle continued," Sister Catherine said gently. "Despite all our best intentions, despite Betty's success, the family patterns repeated. One child's escape meant another's entrapment." The weight of this truth settled over Lily like factory dust, pervasive and impossible to avoid. How do you save one without abandoning another? How do you break cycles without causing new forms of damage? "But," Sister Catherine continued, her voice carrying the authority of 6 decades spent fighting for justice, "there were other families where we tried a different approach. Instead of focusing on individual rescue, we worked to change the systems that created the need for sacrifice." Lily leaned forward, recognizing something important in her mentor's tone. "You're Maria," Sister Catherine said. "She doesn't need to be saved. She needs the conditions that make sacrifice unnecessary." As Lily drove home through Millbrook's sleeping streets, Sister Catherine's words echoed in her mind. The old textile factory loomed against the night sky, its empty windows reflecting the streetlights like dead stars. How many children had those windows watched grow old before their time? How many dreams had been fed into those machines along with the cotton thread? Her house felt different when she returned. Smaller somehow, weighed down by the medical folder still sitting on her coffee table and the memories that wouldn't be contained. Sarah's car was in the driveway, and Lily could see light in the kitchen windows. "Mom?" Sarah called as Lily entered through the back door. "Where were you?" "I was worried." Sarah sat at the kitchen table, still in her work clothes, a cup of coffee growing cold in her hands. At 45, she carried the same determined set to her shoulders that Lily recognized from mirrors, the same careful control that came from a lifetime of managing everyone else's needs. "I was visiting Sister Catherine," Lily said, hanging her keys on the hook David had installed 30 years ago. "How was Jake's game?" "They won. He pitched 7 innings. Sarah's voice carried pride tinged with exhaustion. "Mom, we need to talk about what Dr. Morrison said." Lily poured herself tea from the pot Sarah had prepared, buying time while she chose her words. The kitchen bore traces of her daughter's visit. Dishes washed and put away, mail sorted and stacked, the subtle reorganization that happened when Sarah worried. "My heart is failing," Lily said simply. "It's been carrying too much for too long." The stark honesty seemed to surprise them both. Sarah's coffee cup rattled against its saucer as she set it down. "What does that mean? Treatment options? Timeline?" "It means," Lily said, settling into the chair across from her daughter, "that I'm running out of time to fix the things I broke." Sarah's professional training kicked in. The social worker's instinct to assess and problem solve? "What things?" "Mom, you've spent your entire life helping others. You've been an incredible mother, an amazing advocate. I taught you to sacrifice yourself for everyone else," Lily interrupted. "I taught you that your own needs don't matter as much as other people's emergencies. I taught you to measure your worth by how much you could give away." The words hung between them like an accusation neither woman was prepared to face. Sarah's mouth opened, then closed as she struggled with the truth of it. "That's not. I chose social work because I wanted to help people. You chose social work because you watched me help people. You learned to manage everyone else's crisis because you grew up watching me do the same thing." Lily's voice was gentle but relentless. "When was the last time you said no to someone who needed something?" Sarah's silence was answer enough. "When was the last time you took a vacation that wasn't interrupted by work emergencies? When was the last time you put your own family first without feeling guilty about it?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "That's different," Sarah said finally. "That's my job." "No," Lily said. "That's the pattern. The same one I learned at 10 years old, when I decided my parents' survival mattered more than my childhood. The same one you learned watching me never say no to anyone who needed help." They sat in the quiet kitchen, surrounded by the comfortable disorder of a life built around service to others. Lily's volunteer schedules were pinned to the refrigerator, overlapping with Sarah's work calendar and Jake's school activities. A family organized around everyone else's needs. "There's a girl," Lily said finally. 16 years old, working herself sick to support her grandmother. "She reminds me of myself at that age. And you want to help her. I want to save her from becoming me." The admission felt like tearing off a bandage, exposing wounds Lily hadn't realized were still bleeding. "I want to save you from it too." Sarah reached across the table, covering her mother's hand with her own. "Mom, helping people isn't a disease that needs curing." "Isn't it?" Lily asked. "When it means you never help yourself, when it means your own daughter learns that self-care is selfish, when it means watching someone else's child make the same choices that cost me everything I wanted to be." The kitchen clock ticked toward midnight, marking another day in lives measured by other people's needs. Outside, Millbrook slept while its residents dreamed their separate dreams. Some of escape, some of survival, some of simply making it through another day without losing what little they had left. Lily thought of Maria, probably sitting by her grandmother's bedside, calculating how many hours of work it would take to pay for the next round of medications. She thought of Rosa Martinez, dead now according to Tommy Chen's call earlier that week, having spent her life fighting battles that poverty always seemed to win. Most of all, she thought of the 10-year-old girl in the factory photograph, believing so completely that sacrifice always led somewhere better, never imagining that 60 years later she'd be sitting in a kitchen wondering if love and self-destruction were really as different as she'd always assumed. The factory ID badge lay on the counter where she'd left it, a small piece of cardboard that had somehow become the cornerstone of everything she'd built her life around. Tomorrow, she would need to decide how much of that life to tear down in order to build something different. Tonight she sat with her daughter in the quiet kitchen, both of them finally ready to admit that helping others might not always be the same thing as helping at all. The revelation came on a Tuesday morning, delivered in the sterile confines of Dr. Morrison's office where the scent of antiseptic couldn't quite mask the weight of secrets too long buried. "There's something I need to tell you," Dr. Morrison said, his hands clasped tightly on the desk between them. The routine follow-up appointment had stretched beyond its scheduled time, and Lily could see the conflict written across his face. The same expression she'd learned to recognize in people carrying burdens they weren't sure how to set down. "About my heart?" Lily asked, though something in his tone suggested this was about more than cardiac function. "About my father." The words came out carefully measured, as if he'd rehearsed them. Frank Morrison. He was the foreman at the textile factory in the 1950s. The office seemed to tilt around Lily, present and past colliding with the force of recognition. She'd wondered about Dr. Morrison's familiar features, the way his eyes held a quality she couldn't quite place. Now she understood. She'd been looking at genetics, at the inheritance of choices made decades before his birth. "He hired you," Dr. Morrison continued, his voice barely above a whisper, "when you were 10 years old. I've been your doctor for 15 years, and I've known the whole time that my father—" The sentence hung unfinished, weighted with implications neither of them was ready to fully examine. The memory surfaced unbidden. Frank Morrison's weathered hands teaching her to thread the loom, his gruff voice explaining the rhythm of the machinery. He'd been both her savior and her destroyer, the man who'd given her family hope and stolen her childhood in the same transaction. "You remind me of my boy," he'd said once, during a rare moment of softness. "Jimmy. He's about your age, but he gets to go to school." The guilt in his voice had been unmistakable, even to a 10-year-old's ears. Different circumstances, different choices. She'd wondered about that boy sometimes, the foreman's son who got to carry books instead of thread, who got to dream instead of simply survive. Now she knew. Jimmy Morrison had grown up to become Dr. James Morrison, carrying his own form of inheritance. "He talked about you," Dr. Morrison said, breaking the silence that had stretched between them, especially toward the end. The children who worked in his factory. He kept a list of names. Employees he said deserved better than what the system had offered them. Lily's heart fluttered against her ribs, the irregular rhythm that Dr. Morrison had been monitoring for months. A list? He tried to track people down later, when the factory closed, when he could finally admit what he'd been part of. He wanted to make amends, but most of the records had been destroyed. "You were one of the few he found." The implications settled over Lily like cotton dust, pervasive and impossible to escape. "How long have you known?" "Since medical school. He helped pay for my education with money he'd saved from his factory salary. Blood money, he called it." Dr. Morrison's voice cracked slightly. "He made me promise to use my profession to help the people he'd harmed. When I recognized your name in my patient files, you became my doctor to ease your father's guilt. I became your doctor because you needed care, and because I needed to understand what my family had done." His honesty was raw, unvarnished. But yes, partly to ease his guilt. And my own. The weight of this revelation pressed against Lily's chest, competing with her heart condition for space in her ribcage. How many of her relationships had been built on foundations she didn't understand? How many kindnesses had roots in guilt rather than genuine care? Frank Morrison's final years had been spent in a modest house 2 streets over from where Lily now lived. She'd seen him occasionally at the grocery store, a bent old man who avoided eye contact and moved through the aisles like a ghost. She'd felt pity for him then, not knowing he'd been carrying the weight of children's stolen futures. "The system was bigger than any of us," he'd told his son during those final conversations. "But that doesn't excuse the choices I made. Every child I hired was someone's baby, someone's hope for a better future. I took that hope and fed it into machines." Her phone buzzed against the office desk, a text message that shattered the heavy atmosphere between doctor and patient. Lily glanced at the screen and felt her breath catch. "Abuela in emergency room. Can't afford ambulance. Walking to hospital now." "Maria?" The message was a punch to Lily's solar plexus, combining her worst fears about the girl's situation with the immediate crisis that demanded action. Dr. Morrison saw her face change and leaned forward. "What is it?" "A friend, her grandmother." Lily's voice was tight with controlled panic. "The hospital. Do you have privileges there?" "Yes. What's happening?" As they hurried through the hospital's corridors 20 minutes later, Dr. Morrison's confession seemed less important than the immediate crisis unfolding in the emergency department. They found Maria in the waiting room, her school uniform wrinkled and her eyes red with exhaustion and fear. "She couldn't breathe," Maria explained, her voice carefully controlled. "I called 911, but when they said how much the ambulance would cost..." She gestured helplessly. "I helped her walk. It took us 40 minutes. The image of a 65-year-old woman with heart problems walking nearly 2 miles to the hospital hit Lily like a physical blow. She'd made similar calculations at 10 years old, weighing the cost of medical care against the cost of survival. "Is she your guardian?" Dr. Morrison asked gently. "Yes. Since I was 12, when my parents died." Maria's matter-of-fact delivery couldn't hide the tremor in her voice. "She's all I have." Dr. Morrison disappeared into the medical maze of the emergency department, using his credentials to access information and ensure Maria Santos received proper care. Lily sat with Maria in the waiting room, surrounded by the fluorescent lighting and antiseptic smell that reminded her too much of factories, clean surfaces hiding dangerous undercurrents. "You walked her here," Lily said, the words both question and statement. "The ambulance was $800. We don't have insurance." Maria's voice carried the same resignation Lily remembered from her own childhood, the acceptance of impossible choices as normal parts of life. "Maria." Lily chose her words carefully, aware that she stood at a crossroads where every decision could either help or cause harm. "How much are you spending on your grandmother's medications each month?" The girl's eyes showed panic before she could control it. "We manage. I pick up extra shifts when we need to." "How much?" "About $400. Sometimes more when she has bad episodes." $400. More than Lily's first month's salary at the factory. More than many families in Millbrook had left over after rent and groceries. And Maria was earning it one shift at a time, one lost night of sleep at a time, one deferred dream at a time. "I could help," Lily said carefully. "I have some savings." "No." Maria's response was immediate and firm. "Thank you, but no. We don't take charity." The words were an echo of Lily's own voice at 16, proudly refusing assistance while slowly drowning in responsibilities too heavy for young shoulders. She'd learned that pride early and held it tight, even when it hurt more than it helped. Dr. Morrison returned with updates on Elena's condition, stable but requiring overnight observation and medication adjustments that would cost several $100s. As he spoke, Lily watched Maria's face carefully catalog each expense, already calculating how many extra shifts would be needed to cover this crisis. "There might be programs," Dr. Morrison said gently. "Financial assistance for medications, sliding scale payment plans. We've tried." Maria's voice was flat with experience. "We make too much money to qualify for most programs, but not enough to actually afford anything. The catch-22 of working poverty, earning just enough to be denied help but not enough to be self-sufficient." Lily knew that particular form of limbo intimately. As evening settled over the hospital, Maria Santos was moved to a regular room for overnight observation. Maria refused to leave, settling into an uncomfortable chair beside her grandmother's bed despite having missed an entire day of school and work. "I should be at the diner," Maria said, checking her phone anxiously. "They needed me for the dinner rush." "They'll understand," Lily said, though she knew from experience that employers rarely understood when poverty forced impossible choices between family emergencies and income. "I can't afford to lose this job." The admission slipped out before Maria could stop it, revealing the constant calculations that defined her daily existence. Dr. Morrison had gone home to his own family, but not before quietly arranging for Elena's medications to be covered through a hospital charity program he apparently influenced. A small victory in a war that seemed endless. Sitting in the hospital room as Elena slept fitfully and Maria dozed in her chair, Lily felt the weight of history pressing against her chest. Different decade, different crisis, same impossible mathematics of love and necessity. Her own parents had died in a hospital much like this one, their final years marked by the same struggle between medical needs and financial reality. Despite her sacrifices, despite 8 years of childhood fed into textile machinery, she hadn't been able to save them. The tuberculosis had taken her mother first, then the black lung disease had claimed her father within 6 months. She'd been 18 then, finally free to pursue education, finally old enough to make choices about her own future. Instead, she'd felt lost, unmoored by the sudden absence of the responsibility that had defined her identity since age 10. "What do you want to do now?" Sister Catherine had asked her after the funeral. "I don't know," she'd admitted. "I've never thought beyond keeping them alive." Now, 60 years later, she sat in another hospital room, watching another young woman sacrifice her future for love, and wondered if the patterns could ever be broken, or if they were simply destined to repeat across generations like genetic traits passed down through families. Maria stirred in her chair, checking her phone for the time before looking at her grandmother's still form in the hospital bed. "She raised me," she said quietly, perhaps sensing Lily's thoughts, "after my parents died in the crossing. She worked in factories in El Salvador for 40 years, saved every penny to bring me here for a better life. And now you're working to save her. It's what family does." Maria's voice carried absolute certainty, the same conviction Lily had held at her age. "You take care of the people you love." The truth of it was undeniable, but so was the cost. As visiting hours ended and Lily prepared to drive home, she left Maria her phone number with instructions to call if anything changed. The girl took the information politely, but without commitment, still maintaining the careful boundaries that poverty taught. Never become too dependent on anyone else's kindness. The drive home took Lily past the community center where she'd first met Maria, past the empty textile factory that had shaped both their stories in different ways, past the modest houses where families still struggled with the same impossible equations of love and survival that had defined her own childhood. Dr. Morrison's confession echoed in her mind as she pulled into her driveway. Frank Morrison's son had become her doctor, carrying guilt for choices made before his birth. She'd become Maria's mentor, carrying patterns learned in her own childhood. How many connections were built on foundations of inherited responsibility? How many relationships were really about healing wounds that belonged to previous generations? Inside her house, Lily found Sarah waiting in the kitchen, a legal pad covered with notes spread across the table. "I've been researching," Sarah said without preamble. "Heart failure treatment options, support programs, adaptive equipment for the house." Another list, another attempt to solve unsolvable problems through sheer determination and careful planning. Lily recognized the pattern because she'd perfected it herself, the belief that enough research, enough effort, enough sacrifice could overcome any obstacle. "Sarah," she said gently, "we need to talk about something else first." As she told her daughter about Dr. Morrison's revelation, about Maria's crisis, about the patterns she was finally beginning to recognize, Lily felt the weight of 6 decades settling around them like dust from long-closed factories. Some inheritances were financial, others were choices that echoed across generations, shaping lives in ways that weren't always visible until viewed from the perspective of time. The factory ID badge lay on the counter between them, a small piece of cardboard that had somehow become the cornerstone of everything they'd built their family around. Tomorrow, Maria Santos would be discharged from the hospital with prescriptions she couldn't afford. Tomorrow, Maria would return to her double shifts and her careful calculations. Tomorrow, the cycle would continue unless someone found the courage to break it. But tonight, in the quiet of her kitchen, Lily Cox sat with the daughter who'd inherited her patterns, and wondered if love and destruction were really as different as she'd always believed them to be. The decision came to Lily in the pre-dawn darkness, her heart fluttering irregularly as she stared at the ceiling of her bedroom. Maria Santos would be discharged today, and Maria would face the same impossible choice Lily had confronted 60 years ago. sacrifice everything, or watch someone you love suffer. But this time, Lily had the power to intervene. Her savings account contained $3,847, the remnant of David's life insurance policy that she'd been carefully hoarding for her own medical expenses. It wasn't much, but it would cover Elena's medications for several months, maybe long enough for Maria to focus on school instead of constantly calculating survival. "You can't," Sarah said when Lily explained her plan over breakfast. "Mom, Dr. Morrison said your condition will require expensive treatments. You need that money. Maria needs it more." Lily's voice carried the finality of someone who'd spent a lifetime making such calculations. "I'm 70. She's 16. That's not how this works." Sarah's coffee cup clattered against its saucer. "You can't keep sacrificing yourself for every person who needs help. What happens when you have a crisis and there's no money left?" The argument felt familiar, worn smooth by decades of repetition. Different details, same fundamental disagreement about the value of individual versus collective survival. The memory surfaced without warning. Herself at 16, standing in the scholarship office at the community college. The administrator had explained the opportunity. Full tuition, books included, a chance to study teaching, and break free from the factory's grip. "I need to think about it," she'd said, even though her heart had soared at the possibility. "Don't think too long," the woman had warned. "The deadline is Friday." That night, her father had collapsed during another coughing fit. The doctor's visit had cost a week's wages, and the new medication he prescribed was even more expensive. By Friday, the scholarship application remained unsigned on her kitchen table, while she worked an extra shift to cover the medical bills. The phone call came while Sarah was still arguing about financial responsibility. Maria's voice was carefully controlled, but Lily could hear the exhaustion underneath. "They're discharging my grandmother, but the pharmacy says her new medications will cost $600. A pause, then quieter. "I don't know what to do." "I'll be right there," Lily said, already reaching for her keys. "Mom, no," Sarah grabbed her arm. "You can't keep doing this. You're enabling the same pattern that what? That kept our family afloat when your father lost his first job? That paid for your college when the scholarship didn't cover everything?" Lily's voice sharpened with decades of suppressed frustration. "This pattern you're so worried about also built the life that gave you choices I never had." The words hung between them like an accusation neither woman was prepared to fully examine. Sarah released her mother's arm, her face pale with the recognition of truths she'd never wanted to acknowledge. At the hospital pharmacy, Lily handed over her debit card while Maria protested weakly. The transaction depleted nearly a quarter of her savings. But watching the relief flood, Maria's face felt like the first purely good decision she'd made in years. "I'll pay you back," Maria promised, clutching the medication bags. "Focus on school," Lily replied, knowing they both understood the impossibility of repayment on a 16-year-old's wages. That evening, Tommy Chen arrived unannounced, carrying a manila envelope and wearing the expression of someone delivering difficult news. "Rosa died last week," he said without preamble. "Heart attack. She was working 3 jobs, trying to support her daughter's family." The news hit Lily like a physical blow. Rosa Martinez, her first friend at the factory, the girl who dreamed of escape and rebellion, dead at 69, still trapped in the same cycles of survival that had defined their childhood. "She never got out," Tommy continued, settling heavily into David's old chair. "Married young, had kids, spent her whole life taking care of everyone else. Just like me," Lily finished. They sat in silence, 2 survivors contemplating the mathematics of sacrifice. Tommy had escaped through education, built a successful business, raised children who'd never known poverty. But the guilt of his privileged trajectory had followed him through 6 decades, manifesting in generous donations and careful distance from the community that had shaped him. "I should have done more," he said finally. "Should have helped Rosa, should have helped you." "We all made the choices we thought we had to make." Lily's voice carried a weariness that seemed to settle into her bones. "The question is whether those choices created anything lasting or just passed the same problems to the next generation." As Tommy left, promising to return with Rosa's photographs and memories, Lily sat alone in her living room, surrounded by the evidence of a life spent in service to others. Her depleted bank account, Sarah's inherited patterns of self-sacrifice, Maria's grateful face as she'd clutched medications that would keep her grandmother alive for a few more months. The factory ID badge lay on the coffee table, that small piece of cardboard that had somehow become the foundation of everything she'd built her identity around. Tomorrow she would need to decide whether breaking patterns meant stopping the help that people desperately needed, or finding ways to help that didn't require anyone to lose themselves in the process. But tonight she grieved for Rosa Martinez and wondered if love and self-destruction were really as different as she'd always believed them to be. Sarah's voice cut through the kitchen like a surgeon's blade, precise and unforgiving. "You gave her $300 yesterday. $300, Mom. When was the last time you spent that much on yourself?" Lily stood at the sink, her hands trembling slightly as she washed the same plate for the third time. The confrontation had been building for days, ever since Sarah discovered the bank withdrawal slip tucked between grocery receipts. Maria needed, Mrs. Patterson's grandson needed, the literacy program needed. Sarah's professional composure finally cracked. "When do you need, Mom? When do you matter?" The question hung in the air like factory smoke, acrid and inescapable. When did she matter? Lily couldn't remember a time when her own needs had taken precedence over someone else's crisis. The memory surfaced unbidden, her parents' final weeks, when every breath had been a struggle and every medication had been a choice between hope and financial ruin. She'd been 22 then, exhausted from years of factory work but unable to imagine any other way of being. "You don't have to stay," her mother had whispered, her voice barely audible over the labored breathing. "You've done enough, Mija. You've given us everything." But she had stayed, through the final hospital bills and funeral expenses, through the months of grief that followed. And then she'd met David, whose immigrant's understanding of sacrifice had felt like coming home. "I learned it from watching you," Sarah continued, her voice breaking. "This compulsion to fix everyone else's problems. I can't say no to overtime, can't turn away a client in crisis, can't put my own family first without feeling guilty. And now I'm watching you teach the same thing to that girl." Jake appeared in the doorway, his 17-year-old frame filling the space as he took in the scene. His mother crying, his grandmother gripping the sink edge for support. "What's happening?" he asked, the question carrying undertones of a childhood spent watching the women in his family sacrifice themselves for others. "Your grandmother had a heart episode at the community center," Sarah said, wiping her eyes, "because she's been pushing herself beyond her limits trying to save everyone else." Lily's chest tightened, remembering the moment when the world had tilted sideways, when she'd found herself on the floor of the community center with Maria's frightened face hovering above her. "Maria called 911, Lily said quietly. "She stayed with me until the paramedics arrived." "And then what?" Sarah's voice carried the weary knowledge of someone who'd seen this pattern repeated too many times. "Did you tell her it wasn't her fault? Did you make sure she didn't blame herself for your collapse?" The truth was complicated. Maria had blamed herself, had insisted on riding in the ambulance, had offered to pay for Lily's medical expenses with money she couldn't spare. Another generation learning that love meant taking responsibility for everyone else's pain. "She's just a child," Lily whispered. "So were you," Sarah replied. "And look what it cost you." The hospital bed felt like surrender. Lily lay propped against thin pillows, watching Dr. Morrison adjust her IV drip with the careful attention of someone whose professional duty was complicated by personal guilt. Her heart monitor beeped irregularly, a mechanical reminder that decades of carrying everyone else's weight had finally taken its toll. "The episode was minor," Dr. Morrison said, his voice carrying the measured calm she'd learned to associate with carefully managed bad news. "But your heart is telling us something important. We need to talk about lifestyle changes." Through the window, Millbrook spread out below like a patchwork quilt of memories. She could see the empty textile factory, its broken windows catching afternoon light like dead eyes. Somewhere out there, Maria was probably finishing her shift at the diner, calculating whether she could afford to visit during evening hours or if the bus fare was needed for her grandmother's medications. "Lifestyle changes," Lily repeated, the phrase feeling foreign on her tongue. At 70, with a lifetime of patterns carved into her bones, the concept of change seemed as impossible as reversing the flow of time. The memories surfaced like a bubble rising through water. David's voice, gentle but firm, trying to convince her to let him handle the grocery shopping for Mrs. Chen next door. "You don't have to carry everyone's burdens, mi amor," he'd said, using the endearment that always made her heart flutter. "Sometimes helping people means letting them solve their own problems." "She's 85 and has no family," Lily had protested, already reaching for her coat. "And you're working 60-hour weeks between the factory supervisor job and the community center. When do you rest? When do you take care of yourself?" The question had irritated her then, seemed selfish and indulgent. Now, lying in a hospital bed with her own heart failing, she wondered if David had been trying to save her from something she couldn't see. Tommy Chen arrived during visiting hours, carrying a weathered photo album and the careful expression of someone bearing witness to time's relentless passage. At 70, he moved with the stiffness of age, but retained the sharp intelligence that had lifted him out of Millbrook's cycle of poverty. "I brought Rosa's pictures," he said, settling into the visitor's chair with a grunt. "Her daughter thought you should have them." The photographs told the story of a life lived in service to others. Rosa at 25, holding her newborn daughter with exhausted joy. Rosa at 40, standing behind the counter of the diner where she'd worked for 15 years. Rosa at 60, gray-haired and tired but still smiling at a grandchild's birthday party. "She never stopped working," Tommy said quietly, "even after her husband left. Even when her arthritis got so bad she could barely hold the coffee pot. She just kept going because everyone needed her to keep going." Lily traced her finger along one photograph. Rosa at 16, standing beside the textile loom where they'd first met. Her friend's face held the same fierce determination that Lily had seen in Maria's eyes. The same conviction that sacrifice always led somewhere better. "I should have helped her more," Tommy continued. "When I started making real money, I should have insisted. But Rosa was proud, said she didn't want charity." "We all said that," Lily replied. "We all learned that accepting help was weakness. And now you're watching that girl, Maria, learn the same lesson." The observation hit like a physical blow. Maria, who politely refused assistance while working herself toward exhaustion. Maria, who apologized for imposing when Lily had driven her to the hospital. Maria, who carried guilt for everyone else's circumstances while refusing to acknowledge her own worth. Dr. Morrison returned with Tommy's departure, carrying a folder thick with test results and treatment recommendations. As he explained medication adjustments and activity restrictions, Lily found herself thinking about the patterns that had shaped 3 generations of women in her family. "There's something else," Dr. Morrison said, his voice carrying the weight of long-held secrets. "My father, before he died, he asked me to do something if I ever found you." He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a sealed envelope, yellowed with age. "He wrote this 20 years ago, but never had the courage to deliver it." Lily's hands shook as she opened the envelope, revealing Frank Morrison's careful handwriting on faded stationery. "Dear Lily, I know this letter can't undo the damage I caused, but I need you to know that hiring children was the worst thing I ever did. You were 10 years old and you should have been playing with dolls, not feeding thread into industrial machinery. I told myself I was helping families survive, but I was really helping a system that fed on children's futures. Every child I hired was someone's stolen dream, someone's sacrificed potential. You grew up to be an extraordinary woman despite what I took from you, not because of it. Your strength came from who you were, not from what you endured. I hope someday you can forgive an old man who spent 40 years trying to forget what he'd done to children who deserved better. Frank Morrison." The letter fluttered to the hospital bedsheet as Lily absorbed its contents. Forgiveness, the final component in equations she'd been trying to balance for 60 years. "He carried that guilt until the day he died," Dr. Morrison said softly. "It's why he insisted I become a doctor, why he made me promise to take care of the people he'd harmed." Lily looked at this man who'd spent his career trying to heal wounds his father had inflicted. Another child shaped by choices made before his birth. How many generations carried the weight of previous decisions? How many lives were built around inherited guilt and responsibility? "What did you learn from watching him?" she asked. "That good intentions don't excuse harmful actions. That systems matter more than individual virtue. that carrying guilt doesn't help anyone if it doesn't lead to actual change. The words settled over her like a blanket, warm with the possibility of absolution. Frank Morrison had carried guilt that changed nothing except his own peace of mind. She'd carried responsibility that helped individuals but never challenged the conditions that created their need for help. Maria appeared in the doorway as visiting hours ended, her school uniform wrinkled and her eyes bright with worry. She carried a small bouquet of flowers, probably purchased with money that should have gone toward groceries. "I'm sorry," Maria said, the automatic apology of someone who'd learned to take responsibility for everyone else's pain. "This is my fault. I shouldn't have let you help us." Looking at this girl who'd inherited the same patterns that had defined her own life, Lily finally understood what David had been trying to tell her all those years. Love didn't require destruction of the self. Service didn't demand sacrifice of dreams. Sometimes the most radical act of care was teaching people that they mattered too. "Maria," she said gently, "sit down. We need to talk about what it really means to help each other." Outside the hospital window, Millbrook settled into evening, its streets lined with houses where families continued their ancient struggles with love and necessity. But in this sterile room, between a 70-year-old woman and a 16-year-old girl, something new was beginning, a conversation about breaking cycles instead of perpetuating them, about building systems instead of creating dependencies, about the radical possibility that caring for others might actually require learning to care for yourself first. The decision crystallized during Lily's final night in the hospital, when the pre-dawn darkness brought clarity instead of restless worry. She would not simply give Maria money or advice. She would build something that could outlast her own failing heart. Something that honored David's memory while breaking the patterns that had defined their family for generations. "I want to create a support network," she told Sister Catherine the following afternoon, her voice gaining strength with each word. The assisted living facility's common room hummed with quiet activity around them, but Lily felt the focused intensity that came with purpose finally aligned with possibility. Sister Catherine's eyes sharpened with interest. "Tell me more. Not individual rescue like we've been doing, not charity that creates dependency, a system that addresses root causes, child care during work hours, emergency funds that don't require personal depletion, academic support that doesn't depend on individual volunteers burning out." The idea had been forming since her conversation with Maria in the hospital. The girl had sat beside her bed, mechanically arranging the flowers she'd brought while cataloging all the ways she was failing everyone around her. School performance slipping due to work demands. Grandmother's medications still unaffordable despite Lily's help. The constant calculation of which needs could be met and which would have to wait. "I keep thinking there has to be a better way," Maria had said, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who'd never been allowed to rest. "But every time I try to change something, something else breaks." That's when Lily had understood. Individual solutions to systemic problems only moved the burden around. They never eliminated it. Maria needed more than financial assistance or tutoring. She needed a community that could support her family without requiring her childhood as payment. Now, explaining her vision to Sister Catherine, Lily felt the excitement that had been missing from her advocacy work for years. Instead of responding to crises, they would prevent them. Instead of asking individuals to sacrifice for others, they would create systems where sacrifice became unnecessary. "You're talking about changing how the whole community thinks about mutual aid," Sister Catherine said, her voice carrying the approval of someone who'd spent 6 decades fighting the same battles. "I'm talking about learning from David's approach instead of repeating my mistakes." The memories surfaced with startling clarity, David's solution to her compulsive volunteering. Instead of arguing with her about individual instances of overcommitment, he'd quietly organized their neighborhood into a network of shared responsibilities. Mrs. Patterson's groceries became a rotating duty among 5 families. The Johansson children's after-school care was split between neighbors who each contributed according to their abilities. Problems that had once fallen entirely on Lily's shoulders were distributed across a web of support that strengthened everyone involved. "This is how we did it in my village," he'd explained when she'd marveled at how smoothly the system worked. One person carrying everything breaks down. Many people carrying small pieces can go on forever. Dr. Morrison arrived as Sister Catherine and Lily were sketching out preliminary plans on the back of a medical form. His presence had become less awkward since his father's letter, their relationship shifting from guilt management to genuine collaboration. "I've been thinking about what you said," he told Lily, "about systems versus individual intervention. The hospital has a community health initiative that's been looking for local partners." He pulled out his phone, scrolling through emails with the focused energy of someone who'd found a way to channel inherited guilt into productive action. "There's funding available for programs that address social determinants of health, housing stability, food security, educational support. Exactly what you're describing." Lily felt something shift in her chest, a lightening that had nothing to do with her cardiac medication. For the first time in decades, her impulse to help aligned with resources that could create lasting change instead of temporary relief. Tommy Chen arrived during their planning session, carrying coffee and the bemused expression of someone watching his childhood friend discover new possibilities at 70. "Sarah told me you were scheming something," he said, settling into an available chair. She seemed torn between admiration and terror. "I want to break the cycle," Lily said simply. "For Maria, for Sarah, for every family that gets trapped in choosing between basic needs and basic dignity." "About time," Tommy replied. "I've been trying to figure out how to give back without creating more dependency." This sounds like something that could actually work. Over the following weeks, their informal planning sessions grew into structured meetings. Sarah attended reluctantly at first, her social work training making her skeptical of grand solutions to complex problems. But as they developed specific protocols, emergency funds with built-in repayment systems, childcare cooperatives that shared costs and responsibilities, academic support that trained older students to teach younger ones, her professional skepticism gave way to cautious optimism. "You're talking about changing how an entire community thinks about mutual support," she said during one evening session at Lily's kitchen table. "That's not a program, that's a cultural shift." "Maybe that's what we need," Lily replied. "Maybe individual virtue isn't enough anymore." Jake surprised everyone by becoming the project's most enthusiastic supporter. His generation's comfort with technology proved invaluable for creating communication systems that could coordinate resources without requiring constant management by volunteers. More importantly, his questions forced the adults to examine assumptions they'd been carrying for decades. "Why do people have to prove they deserve help?" he asked during one planning session. "Why can't the default be that everyone deserves basic support?" The question hung in the air like a challenge to everything they'd been taught about worthiness and assistance. Maria, who'd started attending meetings after initially insisting she didn't belong in planning sessions for her own benefit, looked up from the notes she'd been taking. "Because if you don't make people prove they need help, they might take advantage," she said, repeating the logic that had shaped her own careful approach to accepting assistance. "But what if the system is designed so that taking advantage actually helps everyone?" Jake persisted. "What if contributing to other people's success is how you access support for yourself?" Lily watched the conversation unfold between her grandson and the girl who reminded her so much of her younger self, and realized they were designing something she'd never imagined possible. A framework where helping others and helping yourself were the same action, where individual well-being and community strength reinforced each other instead of competing for limited resources. Sister Catherine, despite her advanced age, proved to be their most effective advocate with local institutions. Her decades of relationships with church leaders, school administrators, and city officials opened doors that might have remained closed to less established voices. Dr. Morrison's medical credentials provided legitimacy with healthcare providers and social service agencies. Tommy's business connections offered potential funding sources and practical expertise about sustainable operations. But it was Maria's quiet presence that transformed their theoretical discussions into something urgently real. Every protocol they developed was tested against her actual circumstances. Would this help a 16-year-old working 2 jobs? Would that create additional barriers for families already struggling with language and documentation issues? Would their solutions address immediate crises without perpetuating long-term dependency? "I want to be part of designing this," Maria said one evening, her voice carrying newfound authority. Not just someone who receives help, but someone who helps create the system. Lily felt something profound shift in that moment, the recognition that breaking cycles required more than changing who gave and who received. It required changing the fundamental assumption that some people were helpers and others were helped, that some people had resources and others had needs, that some people mattered more than others in the grand equations of community survival. As autumn settled over Millbrook, their meetings moved from Lily's kitchen to the community center, from private planning to public presentation. The town's response was mixed. Enthusiasm from some quarters, skepticism from others, resistance from those who benefited from existing power structures. But slowly, carefully, the network began to take shape. The first small victory came when Maria Santos received her medications through their newly established emergency fund. But instead of creating debt or dependency, the transaction connected her with other elderly immigrants who needed translation services she could provide. Help flowed in multiple directions, creating strength instead of obligation. Watching Maria coordinate between English-speaking medical staff and Spanish-speaking patients, Lily finally understood what David had been trying to teach her all those years. Love didn't require self-destruction. Service didn't demand sacrifice of dreams. The most radical act of care was creating systems where everyone's contributions mattered, where everyone's needs were valid, where helping others was how you helped yourself survive and thrive. For the first time in 60 years, Lily Cox felt like she was building something that could outlast her own life, not just helping individuals, but changing the conditions that created their need for help in the first place. The transformation happened gradually, like dawn breaking over Millbrook's weathered streets. What had started as emergency meetings in Lily's kitchen evolved into something neither she nor her collaborators had fully anticipated: a fundamental shift in how their community understood mutual aid and shared responsibility. 6 months after their first planning session, the Millbrook Community Support Network operated out of 3 locations: the Community Center, where families accessed resources and children received tutoring; the renovated backroom of Tommy's hardware store, which housed their emergency fund and coordination hub; and Sister Catherine's assisted living facility, where elderly residents provided phone support and administrative assistance to working families. Lily stood in the community center's main room on a Thursday evening, watching the organized chaos that had become their weekly coordination meeting. Maria moved between clusters of families, her clipboard filled with resource requests and volunteer offers, her Spanish and English flowing seamlessly as she connected needs with capabilities. The girl who 6 months ago had apologized for imposing had become their most effective coordinator, her experience navigating complex systems making her invaluable to other families facing similar challenges. "Mrs. Cox," called out Ana Ramirez, a mother of 3 who'd joined their network after losing her job at the closed textile factory. "The childcare cooperative has a waiting list of 8 families. We need to expand." Instead of the familiar weight of impossible demand, Lily felt the satisfaction of problems that could actually be solved. Their childcare system operated on time banking principles that Jake had researched. Parents contributed hours according to their schedules and abilities, earning credits they could use when they needed care for their own children. No money changed hands, but resources flowed efficiently to where they were needed most. "Talk to Maria Santos," Lily suggested, indicating an older woman organizing school supplies at a nearby table. Carmen was Elena's sister-in-law, recently arrived from El Salvador with decades of experience caring for children. She's been looking for ways to contribute that don't require perfect English. The memories surfaced unbidden. Herself at 18, newly orphaned and adrift, unsure how to exist without the consuming responsibility that had defined her identity since childhood. She'd felt useless then, her value tied entirely to how much she could sacrifice for others. It had taken David's patient guidance to help her understand that her worth wasn't measured by how much she could endure. "You don't have to earn love through suffering, mi amor," he'd said during one of their early conversations. "Sometimes the greatest gift you can give people is letting them see that you value yourself." Now, watching Carmen's face light up as Ana explained the childcare cooperative's needs, Lily finally understood what David had meant. Carmen wasn't being rescued. She was being recognized for skills and experience that had value independent of her immigration status or language barriers. The interaction strengthened both women while addressing a community need. Dr. Morrison arrived as the evening's formal meeting began, carrying updates from the hospital's community health partnership. Their collaborative approach had caught attention from state health officials, who were studying their model for potential replication in other rural communities. The Emergency Medication Fund has prevented 14 trips to the emergency room this quarter, he reported to the assembled group. But more importantly, we're seeing families engage with preventive care because they're not afraid of medical bankruptcy. The success felt surreal to Lily, who'd spent decades watching individual acts of kindness disappear into systemic problems like water into sand. This was different, sustainable, expanding, creating ripple effects that strengthened the entire community rather than depleting the helpers. Sarah had initially approached the project with professional skepticism, but her expertise in social services proved invaluable for navigating regulatory requirements and securing formal recognition from county agencies. More personally, her involvement had begun healing the fractures that decades of inherited sacrifice patterns had created in their relationship. "I'm learning to say no to work emergencies," Sarah admitted during a quiet moment between agenda items. "Not because I don't care, but because sustainable helping requires sustainable helpers." The admission represented years of therapy and reflection, painful conversations about boundaries and inherited trauma that neither woman had wanted to face. But watching their community network thrive had provided living proof that caring for others didn't require destroying yourself in the process. Tommy moved through the meeting with the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd finally found a way to channel guilt into productive action. His hardware store had become an unofficial community bulletin board, where job opportunities, housing leads, and resource requests were shared informally throughout the week. The business connections he'd spent decades building were now conduits for opportunities that reached families who'd previously been excluded from such networks. "The Hendersons need help moving this weekend," he announced. "Jim threw out his back and they can't afford professional movers. I've got a truck, and Maria's organized a crew of teenagers who need community service hours." Another small example of how their system worked: needs met through existing relationships and resources rather than emergency responses that burned out individual volunteers. The teenagers would earn required service hours while learning practical skills. The Hendersons would receive help without taking on debt or obligation. The community would strengthen bonds between generations and neighbors. Sister Catherine attended meetings via video call from her assisted living facility, her sharp mind cutting through logistical complications with the authority of 6 decades spent organizing social justice initiatives. Despite her physical frailty, she'd become their most effective advocate with institutional partners. "The state education department wants to pilot our after-school program in 3 other districts," she reported from her tablet screen. "They're particularly interested in our peer tutoring model and the way we've integrated family support services." Lily felt a flutter of pride mixed with amazement. Their informal response to Maria's crisis had evolved into something worth replicating, something that addressed systemic problems rather than just alleviating individual suffering. The evening's most significant agenda item was Maria's announcement about her college plans. The girl who'd been prepared to drop out of high school to work full-time had been accepted to the state university with a full scholarship, her essay about community organizing catching the attention of admissions officers. "I want to study social work and community development," Maria explained to the assembled group, "but I also want to keep coordinating here, at least through video calls. This network, it's not just about helping people. It's about changing how people think about what they deserve and what they can offer." The transformation in Maria's voice was remarkable, from the careful apologies of someone who'd learned to minimize her own needs, to the confident authority of someone who understood her own value and potential. She would leave for college in the fall, but the systems they'd built would continue operating, supported by the dozen other coordinators who'd been trained in their methods. Jake, now a high school senior, had documented their entire process for a civics project that was being submitted to a national competition. His generation's instinctive understanding of network effects and systemic thinking had helped them avoid the pitfalls of traditional charity models. The coolest part isn't just that we're helping people, he explained to his classmates in a presentation Lily had watched on video. It's that we're proving you can design systems where helping other people is how you help yourself, where everyone contributes and everyone benefits. As the meeting wound down and families gathered their belongings, Lily remained in her chair, absorbing the energy of a community that had learned to care for itself differently. The room buzzed with conversations about weekend projects, shared meals, babysitting exchanges, and resource sharing that happened naturally now, without central coordination or emergency intervention. Maria approached as the last families departed, carrying the folder that contained contact information for the families they served and the volunteers who kept their network functioning. "Mrs. Cox," she said, her voice carrying the affection that had grown between them over months of shared work, "I wanted you to know, this changed everything for me. Not just the help with my grandmother's medications, but understanding that I could be someone who builds solutions instead of just surviving problems." Lily felt her heart flutter, not with the irregular rhythm of cardiac distress, but with the recognition of legacy finally aligned with values. This was what David had been trying to teach her, what Sister Catherine had modeled in her decades of advocacy, what she'd finally learned to create at 70 years old. "You built this as much as anyone," Lily replied. "Maybe more, because you understood what we needed to change." Outside, Millbrook settled into evening routines that looked superficially similar to those of 6 months ago. But beneath the surface, something fundamental had shifted. Children did homework in spaces where their parents didn't have to choose between supervision and income. Elderly residents shared skills and knowledge instead of accepting charity. Families faced crises with community support that didn't require individual heroes or personal sacrifice. The thread of sacrifice had finally been rewoven into something stronger, a fabric of mutual aid that supported everyone without consuming anyone, a legacy worthy of the love that had inspired it. The diagnosis came on a Tuesday morning in early spring, delivered with the clinical precision that Dr. Morrison had learned to balance with compassion. Lily's heart was failing faster than their medications could compensate, the muscle tissue damaged by decades of stress and overwork beyond what modern cardiology could repair. "How long?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. 6 months. Maybe less. We can manage your comfort, but…" He gestured helplessly at the test results spread across his desk, the stark evidence of a body that had finally reached its limits. Lily nodded, feeling oddly peaceful rather than panicked. She'd been preparing for this conversation since her first heart episode at the community center, had felt the gradual weakening that no amount of determination could overcome. What surprised her was the absence of regret. For the first time in her life, she faced mortality knowing that her work would continue without her. "There are things I need to arrange," she said, already mentally cataloging the conversations that needed to happen, the transitions that required careful management. "Lily." Dr. Morrison's voice carried the weight of their shared history, the complicated redemption they'd both found through their collaboration. "My father would be proud of what you've built, what you've become." She thought of Frank Morrison's letter, the guilt he'd carried to his grave, the systems of exploitation he'd perpetuated despite his personal kindness. "We all became what our circumstances required. The difference is learning to change those circumstances for other people." The first person she told was Sister Catherine, driving to the assisted living facility with the windows down and spring air carrying the scent of new growth. Her mentor sat in the garden courtyard, her frail hands still capable of decisive gestures as she absorbed the news. "You're not afraid," Sister Catherine observed, her voice carrying the certainty of someone who'd learned to read hearts as clearly as faces. "I'm grateful," Lily replied, surprised by the truth of it. "For the time I had, for the work we did, for seeing Maria become who she's becoming." Sister Catherine smiled, the expression transforming her aged features with remembered beauty. "David would be proud. You finally learned the difference between loving people and losing yourself for them." The memories surfaced with painful clarity. David's final weeks when the cancer had progressed beyond hope, but their love had deepened into something transcendent. He'd used his remaining energy not to fight the inevitable, but to ensure she understood the lessons he'd been trying to teach for 40 years. "Promise me something, am I amor?" he'd whispered during one of their last conversations. Promise me you'll learn to receive love as freely as you give it. Promise me you'll teach our family that caring for others includes caring for yourself. She'd promised then, meaning it, but not understanding how to fulfill it. Only now, facing her own mortality with systems in place to continue their work, did she comprehend what he'd been asking. The conversation with Sarah was harder, held in Lily's living room surrounded by the photographs and mementos that documented 7 decades of service to others. Her daughter's professional composure cracked immediately, revealing the frightened child beneath the competent social worker. "There has to be something else we can try," Sarah said, her voice tight with the controlled panic Lily recognized from her own responses to medical crises. "Experimental treatments. Specialists in other cities." "Sarah." Lily reached across the space between their chairs, taking her daughter's hands in her own. "I'm 70 years old. I've had a full life. A meaningful life. I don't want to spend my remaining time fighting a battle I can't win. But the network needs you. Maria needs you. I need you." The admission hung between them, raw with decades of complicated love and inherited patterns finally being acknowledged. Lily squeezed her daughter's hands, feeling the calluses earned through years of caring for everyone else. "The network will thrive without me because we built it to be sustainable. Maria is already coordinating better than I ever did. And you." Lily paused, choosing her words carefully. "You need to learn that your value doesn't depend on how much you can do for other people." Jake's response surprised her with its maturity. At 17, he'd grown into the kind of young man who could process difficult emotions without requiring adult protection from reality. "I want to document everything," he said, his voice steady despite the tears in his eyes. "Your stories about the factory, about meeting Grandpa David, about building the network. For the families we're helping now, but also for future generations who might need to understand how change happens." The project became their shared focus over the following weeks. Lily telling stories while Jake recorded them, their conversations weaving together personal history with social analysis. She told him about Rosa Martinez's dreams of escape, about Sister Catherine's quiet rebellion, about Tommy Chen's survivor guilt and eventual redemption. She told him about Frank Morrison's complicity and his son's attempt at atonement, about the slow recognition that individual virtue wasn't enough to address systemic problems. "The hardest lesson," she said during one of their recording sessions, "was learning that you can love people without sacrificing yourself for them. That sometimes the most loving thing you can do is teach people to value themselves." Tommy visited almost daily, bringing memories and photographs that helped fill in the gaps of their shared history. At 70, he moved carefully but retained the sharp intelligence that had lifted him out of poverty. Their conversations ranged across 6 decades of friendship, examining choices made and paths taken with the perspective that only time could provide. "I should have done more," he said during one visit, the familiar refrain of survivor guilt threading through his voice. "You did what you could within the systems that existed," Lily replied. "But more importantly, you helped us build new systems. That's what matters." Maria's visits were the most bittersweet, the girl who'd reminded Lily so much of her younger self now transformed into a confident young woman preparing for college. The network had grown around her, supporting her family while nurturing her own development in ways that individual charity never could have achieved. "I keep thinking about what would have happened if we hadn't met," Maria said during one afternoon visit. "If you hadn't been at the community center that night. Someone else would have helped you," Lily said with certainty. "Maybe not in the same way, but you were always going to succeed. You had the intelligence and determination. Our network just made it possible without requiring you to sacrifice everything else." The distinction mattered, representing the difference between rescue and empowerment, between charity and justice. Maria hadn't been saved. She'd been supported while saving herself, her success strengthening the entire community rather than depleting its resources. Dr. Morrison adjusted her medications as spring progressed into summer, managing symptoms while avoiding interventions that would extend suffering without improving quality of life. Their conversations had evolved beyond medical necessity into philosophical reflection about legacy and redemption. "I became a doctor to atone for my father's choices," he said during one visit. "But working with your network taught me that real atonement means changing systems, not just treating symptoms." The observation felt like completion. Frank Morrison's son had learned the lessons his father had struggled to grasp, using inherited guilt as motivation for sustainable change rather than personal torment. As summer settled over Millbrook, Lily felt the peculiar peace that came with approaching endings. Her body was failing, but her work had achieved something she'd never imagined possible: a model for community care that didn't require individual sacrifice, a framework for mutual aid that strengthened everyone involved. The network operated smoothly without her daily involvement, coordinated by Maria and other volunteers who'd internalized its principles and procedures. Families received support without stigma or dependency. Children pursued education without abandoning family responsibilities. Elderly residents contributed skills and wisdom instead of accepting charity. Sitting in her garden on warm evenings, watching fireflies dance among David's roses, Lily finally understood what her husband had been trying to teach her. Love didn't require self-destruction. Service didn't demand sacrifice of dreams. The most radical act of care was creating conditions where everyone could thrive, where helping others became a natural expression of community, rather than individual heroism. The factory ID badge lay on her bedside table now, that small piece of cardboard that had somehow become the foundation of everything she'd built her identity around. But its meaning had transformed. No longer a symbol of childhood stolen, but evidence of strength discovered, resilience developed, and ultimately, systems changed. She was ready for whatever came next, knowing that the threads she'd helped weave would continue strengthening the fabric of her community long after her own thread was complete. 6 months after Lily Cox's peaceful death in her own bed, surrounded by the people who'd learned to love without losing themselves, the Millbrook Community Support Network had grown beyond anything its founders had imagined possible. Maria Santos stood at the podium in the renovated community center, her college acceptance letter from the State University folded in her pocket as she addressed the crowd gathered for the first annual Lily Cox Memorial Celebration. At 17, she spoke with the authority of someone who'd learned that her voice mattered, that her experiences had value, that helping others was a form of self-respect rather than self-sacrifice. "Mrs. Cox taught us that breaking cycles requires more than individual strength," Maria said, her eyes scanning the faces in the audience. Families who'd found stability through their network, elderly residents who discovered their skills still had value, teenagers who were learning that success didn't require abandoning the people they loved. "It requires building systems where everyone's contributions matter, where everyone's needs are valid." The community center itself reflected the transformation Lily's vision had inspired. What had once been a place where individuals sought emergency assistance had become a hub of collaborative activity. The walls displayed a coordination board, where families posted resource needs and volunteer offers, creating a marketplace of mutual aid that operated continuously, without requiring crisis intervention. Sarah Cox Martinez sat in the front row with Jake, both of them carrying the complicated grief of survivors who'd learned to love their matriarch, while recognizing the costs of her patterns. Sarah's own work had evolved in the months since her mother's death, her social work practice now focusing on community organizing rather than individual case management. "I'm learning to help people by helping them help each other," she'd explained to Jake recently, "instead of carrying everyone's problems myself." The shift represented years of therapy and reflection, painful conversations about inherited trauma that neither she nor Lily had wanted to face during the older woman's lifetime. But the network's success had provided living proof that caring for others didn't require destroying yourself in the process, and Sarah was slowly learning to apply those lessons to her own life. Jake, now a senior in high school, had documented the network's development for a civics project that was being studied by policy researchers at 3 universities. His generation's instinctive understanding of systemic thinking had helped them avoid the pitfalls of traditional charity models, creating frameworks that addressed root causes rather than managing symptoms. "The coolest part isn't just that we're helping people," he'd told his classmates in a presentation that went viral on social media. "It's that we're proving you can design systems where helping other people is how you help yourself, where everyone contributes and everyone benefits." The presentation had caught the attention of organizers in other communities, leading to speaking engagements and consultation requests that would help fund Jake's college education while spreading their model to new locations. Tommy Chen moved through the celebration with the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd finally found peace with his survivor's guilt. His hardware store had become the unofficial coordination center for the network's practical needs, his business connections now serving families who'd previously been excluded from economic opportunities. At 70, he'd discovered that redemption wasn't about feeling guilty forever. It was about using privilege to create systems that shared opportunity more broadly. Lily would be amazed by this, he said to Dr. Morrison as they watched Maria address the crowd. She always thought small, one family at a time, one crisis at a time. She never imagined we could change how an entire community thinks about mutual support. Dr. Morrison nodded, his own transformation evident in the way he carried himself. Frank Morrison's son had spent his career trying to heal wounds his father had inflicted, but working with the network had taught him that real healing required changing the conditions that created wounds in the first place. The hospital's community health partnership now served as a model for other medical institutions, proving that addressing social determinants of health was more effective than treating symptoms after the fact. She taught us that love doesn't require self-destruction, he replied. That sometimes the most caring thing you can do is refuse to enable unhealthy patterns. Sister Catherine attended the celebration via video call from her assisted living facility, her 90-year-old face bright with satisfaction as she watched the fruition of ideas she'd been advocating for 6 decades. Despite her physical frailness, she remained the network's most effective institutional advocate, her relationships with religious and educational leaders opening doors that might have remained closed to less established voices. "This is what justice looks like," she said during her brief remarks to the assembled crowd. "Not individual charity that leaves systems unchanged, but collective action that addresses root causes. Not rescue that creates dependency, but empowerment that builds community strength." The celebration's highlight came when Maria Santos, Maria's grandmother, took the stage to announce the establishment of the Lily Cox Emergency Fund, a resource pool that had grown to over $50,000 through small donations from network families and larger contributions from local businesses that had benefited from the community's increased stability. "In El Salvador, we have a saying," Elena said in carefully practiced English, "Juntos somos más fuertes," together we are stronger. Mrs. Cox taught us that being strong together doesn't mean some people have to be weak alone. The fund operated on principles that would have seemed radical just 2 years earlier. No applications requiring proof of worthiness, no restrictions based on immigration status or employment history, no individual debt created by emergency assistance. Instead, families who received support were expected to contribute to the fund when their circumstances improved, creating a cycle of mutual aid that strengthened over time rather than depleting with use. As the formal program concluded and families mingled in the community center's main room, the evidence of sustainable change was visible everywhere. Children did homework in spaces where their parents didn't have to choose between supervision and income. Elderly residents shared skills and knowledge that had value beyond memory. Teenagers earned community service hours while learning practical skills from adults who appreciated their energy and perspective. The childcare cooperative now served 30 families, operating on time banking principles that ensured everyone contributed according to their abilities and accessed support according to their needs. The peer tutoring program had eliminated the achievement gap between immigrant and native-born students while creating leadership opportunities for older youth. The emergency fund had prevented dozens of families from facing homelessness or medical bankruptcy while building a reserve that continued growing through contributions from those it had helped. Most importantly, the cultural shift Lily had envisioned was becoming embedded in community norms. Families no longer waited for crises to ask for help, and neighbors no longer felt overwhelmed by others' needs. The network had created frameworks where mutual support felt natural rather than extraordinary, where helping others was an expression of community membership rather than individual heroism. Maria found herself surrounded by younger students as the evening wound down, teenagers who saw in her story a model for how to succeed without abandoning the people they loved. Her college plans included studying social work and community development, but she would continue coordinating for the network through video calls and summer visits. "The most important thing Mrs. Cox taught me," she told the students, "was that I could be someone who builds solutions instead of just surviving problems. That my experiences had value, that my voice mattered, that helping others was a way of respecting myself." The transformation in Maria's voice was remarkable, from the careful apologies of someone who'd learned to minimize her own needs, to the confident authority of someone who understood her own power and potential. She would leave for college in the fall, but the systems they'd built would continue operating, supported by the dozen other coordinators who'd been trained in their methods. As families gathered their belongings and prepared to leave, the community center buzzed with conversations about weekend projects, shared meals, babysitting exchanges, and resource sharing that happened naturally now, without central coordination or emergency intervention. The thread of sacrifice had been rewoven into something stronger, a fabric of mutual aid that supported everyone without consuming anyone. Outside, Millbrook settled into evening routines that looked superficially similar to those of 2 years ago. But beneath the surface, everything had changed. The empty textile factory still loomed over the town, but it no longer defined the community's possibilities. Where industrial exploitation had once fed on children's futures, collaborative networks now nurtured everyone's potential. The Lily Cox Memorial Celebration had achieved something more significant than honoring one woman's legacy. It had demonstrated that communities could learn to care for themselves differently, that systems of mutual aid could replace cycles of sacrifice, that love didn't require anyone to lose themselves in service to others. In houses throughout Millbrook, families went to sleep knowing that their neighbors understood both their strengths and their struggles, that tomorrow would bring opportunities to both give and receive support, that their children were growing up in a community that valued everyone's contributions and acknowledged everyone's worth. The network would continue growing, spreading to other communities, adapting to different circumstances while maintaining its core principles. Maria would graduate from college and return to expand their model. Jake would study community development and create new frameworks for youth leadership. Sarah would train other social workers in sustainable helping practices. Dr. Morrison would help other medical institutions address social determinants of health. But the most important legacy wasn't institutional. It was the quiet revolution in how ordinary people understood their relationships to each other. The recognition that true strength came not from individual sacrifice but from collective care. The knowledge that love expressed through justice was more powerful than love expressed through suffering. Lily Cox had died as she'd lived, quietly, without fanfare, surrounded by the people whose lives she'd touched. But the ripples of her transformation continued expanding, carrying the radical message that caring for others could include caring for yourself, that helping people might mean teaching them to value their own worth, that breaking cycles required building systems where sacrifice became unnecessary. The thread of her life had been woven into something larger than any individual story, a tapestry of community care that would shelter and strengthen generations to come. Proof that even the most entrenched patterns could be changed when love learned to express itself through justice rather than self-destruction. In the end, Lily Cox's greatest sacrifice had been giving up the belief that sacrifice was necessary, creating instead a legacy where everyone mattered, everyone contributed, and everyone belonged to a community strong enough to hold them all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Quote.